Let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking the real origins of generational wealth. And to do that, we're going to look at the life of Frederick Trump. But we're not doing a standard biography here. No. As an economic historian, I want us to look at this as a fascinating microeconomic case study of frontier capitalism and risk management. If you really want to understand how massive family empires are built completely from scratch, well, this is your textbook case study on capital formation. To keep things structured, we're mapping his journey as an economic agent through 5 distinct phases: the economics of migration, mining the miners, pivoting to real estate, macro shocks and war, and finally, the first $100,000. Starting with phase 1, the economics of migration. Following his timeline, you immediately see the agility of a truly opportunistic entrepreneur. We're talking about an economic agent physically moving his labor and capital in direct response to emerging market booms across the continent. He wasn't just sitting still. He followed the capital flows, moving from the crowded entry port of New York out to the developing Pacific Northwest, all the way up to the frozen gold fields, and then finally back to the rapidly industrializing boroughs of New York City. Now, the crucial thing to grasp here is the sheer scale of the market forces at play. When a 16-year-old Frederick left his home in Germany for New York back in 1885, he was just one of 1.4 million Germans migrating to the U.S. in that single decade alone. This massive exodus was driven by heavy economic hardship, rapid population growth, and, for Frederick specifically, a real lack of local prospects after his father passed away and left the family in a tough financial spot. So he was quite literally a drop in this massive demographic wave, basically seeking higher yields on his own labor. That takes us to phase 2, mining the miners. Once he hit New York, Frederick traded his labor for capital, working 7 grueling days a week as a barber in these stifling Lower East Side tenements. But by 1891, he had managed to stockpile a foundation of $600. And what did he do? He took that labor-derived capital, headed out west to a booming Seattle, and bought the dairy restaurant. Right there, he transitioned from a laborer to a capital allocator. This reveals a profound risk asymmetry. When the Klondike Gold Rush exploded, Frederick moved north, but instead of taking on the massive, low-probability risk of literally freezing in a river trying to pan for gold himself, he captured the secondary market. He provided the picks and shovels, or in his specific case, the food, shelter, and entertainment that every single prospector desperately needed. It's a classic low-risk, high-margin economic strategy. You capture the wealth generated by a boom without taking on the primary risk of the boom itself. And his responsiveness to market demand? Absolutely ruthless. Early on, they were literally selling frozen horsemeat scavenged off the sides of the northern trails. Basically, whatever calorie-dense food these desperate miners could afford. But the very second those miners actually struck gold and their purchasing power skyrocketed, Frederick adapted instantly. Out went the horsemeat, and in came advertisements for every delicacy on the market, including fresh oysters in the frozen north. He captured that frontier wealth by scaling his supply to match the exact economic state of his consumers. And it was incredibly successful. By 1901, he had successfully extracted around 80,000 marks from the frontier economy, which is equivalent to roughly $400,000 today. He actually tried to repatriate this wealth back to Germany to settle down, but strict military conscription laws forced him right back to America. So this bit of political friction inadvertently guaranteed that his newly accumulated capital would be deployed squarely in the U.S. economy. Which brings us to phase 3, pivoting to real estate. At this point, the demographic shifts were staggering. Back in 1900, Queens had about 150,000 residents and still felt pretty rural. But by 1920, a total demographic explosion pushed it near 470,000. Frederick pivoted his capital into real estate exactly when the overcrowded, teeming population of Manhattan started spilling over the East River. As an economic historian, looking at this, you just see an entrepreneur perfectly timing massive macro-demographic shift. And he wasn't just throwing darts at a map to buy land. He utilized what we call an infrastructure catalyst. He bet his hard-earned capital on the construction of the Queensboro Bridge, which finished up in 1909. He accurately predicted that this massive municipal project would drastically reduce the friction of commuting, and in turn skyrocket private property demand in Queens. So he started building modest homes, fully transforming himself from a frontier hospitality guy into a New York real estate developer. Moving into phase 4, macro shocks and war. Now, as we know, capital accumulation is never a perfectly straight line, and even the smartest economic agents are ultimately at the mercy of global shocks.
Despite his established wealth, his business slammed into some severe macroeconomic headwinds. The outbreak of World War I brought intense anti-German sentiment that made doing business incredibly difficult. On top of that, the total war effort completely repurposed the domestic economy, and the massive wave of European migration, which was the literal engine of his real estate market, just collapsed. But the ultimate shock was biological. In May 1918, during the very first wave of the pandemic, Frederick Trump died suddenly from the Spanish flu at just 49 years old.
And that brings us to our final section, Phase 5, the first $100,000. So, when an economic actor exits the stage prematurely like that, what happens to the wealth they've accumulated? Well, he left his widow, Elizabeth, and his young children a seriously diversified portfolio. We're talking 14 active mortgages generating steady yield, 5 vacant lots prepped for future development, plus substantial liquid savings and market stocks. In today's money, this was well over $500,000. Now, it wasn't billionaire status by any means, but it meant his family had immediate housing security, compounding rent, and a solid capital base. They weren't starting from zero, they were starting from a position of real economic strength.
There's a famous quote from Charlie Munger that hits the nail on the head here. The hardest part of becoming wealthy is acquiring the first $100,000. And Frederick's life brilliantly illustrates this core economic lesson. He did the brutal, high-friction work of actually acquiring that first major block of capital out on the western frontier. He took the physical risks, worked the grueling hours, and navigated a highly volatile gold rush economy just across that crucial threshold where capital can finally begin to compound on its own.
Stepping back and looking at this from a macro-historical perspective, you see a very clear chain of wealth architecture. Step 1, Frederick builds that initial capital foundation. And without that first massive injection of wealth, step 2 absolutely does not happen. His son Fred utilized that foundation to scale up with incredible speed, eventually leveraging massive New Deal housing programs and post-World War II government contracts to build a billion-dollar empire, which in turn paved the way for step 3. His grandson Donald utilizing that massive real estate empire to pivot into Manhattan luxury, media, and ultimately the US presidency. It is literally a cascading sequence of capital utilization spanning over a century. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a question to ponder. When we look back at these early architects of generational wealth, how should we actually view them? Was Frederick Trump an uncompromising opportunist just exploiting the gray areas of a wild frontier? Or was he a hardworking innovator who brilliantly mastered the very specific economies of his time? Think about how initial capital is truly formed, and more importantly, what it enables for the generations that follow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the capital.